Now on to our program. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Sandy Woodson. Sandy has been a video producer and editor at Kansas City PBS for 25 years. She recently quit her full-time job to devote herself to her personal documentary projects. Womontown, created in partnership with Kansas City PBS, was the first of these projects. She is a self-proclaimed straight white girl from north of the river, which in Kansas City means the suburbs. Sandy began researching Kansas City's LGBT history in 2018 and hopes to spend the rest of her life documenting all the amazing untold stories she has discovered. To see the range of her documentary work, you can visit Sandy Woodson's YouTube channel and her publicly posted Facebook photos. And Sierra will put links to both of those in the chat. Please join me in welcoming Sandy Woodson. Sandy, thank you so much. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for creating this amazing documentary, which I just had a great time watching. Just to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in doing this documentary on Womontown?
Yes, and I just realized when you go to my YouTube, you're going to see a lot of drag footage. I need to put my shows there. But anyway, so I was actually, like I say, I'd been researching LGBT history in Kansas City since 2018, working on an idea of the history and current state of HIV/AIDS in Kansas City. And I happened to be at a restaurant in Kansas City called You Say Tomato. And the woman who owns the place introduced me to Karen West, who was actually one of the early organizers of Womontown. And Karen had just sold a house that she bought in Womontown 30 years before. And she just started telling me about it. And it was just so interesting to me that I was like, I want to do this story. So that's kind of how it got started.
That's fantastic. Tell us a little bit about the size and scope. How many people did you interview? How many hours of footage did you put together? What kind of went into the process of creating this highly curated 30 minutes that's riveting to watch?
You know, it's kind of crazy. Originally, you know, COVID hit. And at some point I realized I don't have to stay home to work. So I got the camper that everybody got. Mine was a 1973. And after figuring out where Maryann and Drea were and Barbara Lee, I thought, you know, I'm just going to hit the road. And at the time, the job that I had at the station was as a production manager. I think that was my official title. So I was more involved with, after having done video for quite a long time, I got burned out and I started doing other kind of work at the station. But I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go out to Georgia. I'm going to go to Florida. I'm going to take my camera and my audio recorder and just document stories while I'm out and about. So that's what I did. And I'm so glad that I did that step. Because I was able to scan all of these photos and great things that Maryann and Drea have, that Barbara had. I was able to visit some other people while I was out that way. I met Margie from one of the founders of Lesbian Connection. I met the women at Carefree. Anyway, I did a lot of things. But when I came back to the station, and pitched the idea to the station, they were like, sure, but how are you going to do it? Because you have this other job that you're doing. And so I tried to do it while I was doing that other job. We got all the interviews reshot with a real camera person, had Drea and Maryann fly into town, found the other women that were still in Kansas City that were a part of the early days of Womontown. And there were probably, I think we had 8 of us all together. And in 1 week in June, we shot all the interviews and then they just kind of sat there. So when I realized I wasn't going to be able to get it done without quitting, that's when I quit.
Wow. So this is really like, this film is sort of your COVID journey. On one hand, you literally bought a camper and traveled around to talk to people. And it's also this sort of big life pivot for you to leave the security of your job to make the documentary?
Yeah, I had left the station 2 other times and went freelance for a few years, but I was always partnering with the station for my work. And when I knew they liked the Womontown idea and that they were willing to partner with me on that, so that made it possible to happen. But all in all, I probably spent a year and a half on it. But once we started the serious taping of the interviews and the editing, that was all done within about 6 months. But if it hadn't been for my travels and scanning photos and documents and things along my trip, it would have taken a lot longer and been a lot more difficult. So yeah, it was a great experience. There were things that I experienced in person, like when I went to Carefree Resort and when I met the women who started that place, and I got to meet Margie, and I went to the villages north of Tampa, near you, Julie. And then I went to Gainesville and visited a woman who had 5 acres and was doing her own little community. I would have never been able to do that if I hadn't just gotten in a camper and gone. So.
Wow. Wow. That's exciting. Now most of our audience may know about Carefree, but give us the 2-sentence description of Carefree and tell us who brought you, what brought you to Carefree as a part of this work.
So Barbara, I always call her Barbara Lee. Her name's Barbara, her last name's Lee, but to me it sounds like a first name and middle name. So anyway, when I called her at the beginning of Womontown, she said, "We're packing up, we're getting ready to move, give me a call in a few weeks." Well, I thought that meant she'd still be in Kansas City, but she wasn't. She had taken off for Florida. And I was like, oh, okay. So when I reached out to her later and said, "I'm going to come out and see you," I also wanted to talk to the women who started Carefree Resort, which is near Fort Myers, because I was interested in how that community was started and what was behind that. Because I'm in love with the idea of communities in general. So I wanted to know how that one began. And they were nice enough, the women who started it were nice enough to let me interview them. And it was a very different kind of scenario. But so many of these things tie in together. Everybody knows everybody, you know. Of course, Maryann and Drea know everybody, and that's how I got to know everybody. It was interesting trying to find them. If it wasn't for Facebook, I'm not sure I would have found them. They had Drea's last name wrong at the archives in Kansas City, so I was searching for the wrong person in the beginning. But anyway.
And you might not have had this issue of Sinister Wisdom 98, Land Dykes of the South, which has an article about Womontown in it, but not one about Carefree. As I recall, like I do not think we've done a lot of documentation on Carefree, which is another intentional lesbian community that's built around manufactured homes and RV homes. That's really that's down, as you said, by North Fort Myers. Is that a future project of yours to do some of the history of that community?
I was actually interested in kind of documenting all different types of communities. But I do have to say, and this is me preaching to the choir here, but for me, it was such an epiphany to walk into Carefree. And I'm so happy that I was able to do that, because I had never walked into a space that was all women, you know, and I knew there were 500 women living in that space, and it was a gated community. And it wasn't until I walked in there that I realized how many of my fears that I carry with me on a daily basis about men. You know, I was like, you know, I don't lock my windows at night because I'm afraid a woman's going to come through there. I don't not walk streets at night by myself because I'm afraid a woman's going to attack me. And it's obviously, that's a big generalization, but I was just really hit by that when I was there. And that was something I never would have known or felt if I hadn't gone there, because Womontown wasn't the same as it was back then, or I would have felt it when I walked in there. And I still do. There was still a lot of awesome feelings being in Womontown, of course.
Right. So Carefree, 500, I didn't realize it was up to 500 residents of Carefree now.
I think when everybody's there, it can be up to 500 and they aren't there all year long.
Got it. Got it. And Meryl helpfully points out in the chat something I had forgotten, that there was a time constraint that they used to organize the material for Land Dykes of the South, because the Southern Lesbian Feminist Activist History Project is so voluminous in everything that they create. They send me these huge issues and I send them back and say, well, it needs to be this size. And so then they come up with different constraints. And the constraint that excluded Carefree was the time frame, as Meryl has pointed out. All right, so you're in the pandemic, you bought yourself, what'd you say, it was a 73 RV? And you're
a camper. It wasn't an RV, but yeah,
oh,
and I had to buy and I had to buy a vehicle to pull it with. And at that time, both campers and vehicles were flying off. You couldn't hardly get them. But I had a girlfriend who liked shopping for campers and a girlfriend who had a husband who liked shopping for cars. And I just said, do it. So that's how that all came about.
All right, so you put together the car and the camper, you're tootling around the South, you go to Carefree. Then I'm gonna pause and hear a little bit about the villages, because of course, as a Florida resident, the villages are very much known for being politically to the right, for helping to deliver our state to he who shall not be named during the 2016 election. So my first question is, like, there are lesbians in the villages?
Yes, there was a woman that used to own a lesbian bar, or she was part owner of a lesbian bar in the early 90s, I think, for a couple of years, named Sue Brazelton. And when I was first researching the Cabaret Bar in Kansas City and my early HIV/AIDS history projects, she popped up on Facebook and said she had photos from the bars back in that time. So she invited me to come out and visit her at the villages, and she drove me around, and she mentioned, you know, how conservative it was there. But she said there's an enclave of gay people that kind of banded together. And, you know, they don't all live on the same block or anything. I mean, the villages is huge. I had no idea. She says it's if Disneyland built a retirement community, because it has, you know, as you guys probably already know, it has these 5 different areas and they're all themed and all of that. But she and her, I'm not sure if they're married or just partners, but they've been there for several years, and they know they've got some neighbors that they don't want to deal with, and they've managed to avoid them. So nobody's camping on their lawn, you know, doing anything ridiculous, thankfully.
So you got some more photos there, did some more research, then tootled on up to Gainesville, at another, I'm assuming another kind of intentional lesbian community up there.
To a degree. I mean, Jenna has 5 acres. And when she moved there, she actually was my connection. And I'm sure Marian and Drea gave me her contact info. I went and researched in Southern Missouri, an intentional lesbian community in Southern Missouri. Well, Jenna was one of the first people who started that. So when they moved out of Missouri, they went to Florida looking for a space, and she has 5 acres there. And what I love is that she has a RV you can rent. She has a space for your own RV. She has a cabin, and she has a main building, and she has a studio because she's an amazing artist. And that's the kind of setup I personally would like to have. So I loved seeing that she was doing that and how she put it together.
Got it.
Yeah, I got to see a lot of different types of communities in my travels.
That's fantastic. So you put everything together. I wanted to show, I think we have time. Max, I want to show this brief clip and have you then, Sandy, talk a little bit about the process of after you put together all of after you've done all the footage, done all of the interviews, had it all together, there's this kind of part that I really think of as the magic of filmmaking, where you really sort of think about what's the overall story and the arc of what you're going to tell. And we're going to show just a brief 30-second clip from the film that was really striking to me, and I'll talk about it afterwards. Right now, we'll just look at the clip since Max has it all queued up. Go ahead, Max.
But she said, Sue, we can do it. This is the only time we can afford a house. Let's do it. And she was the first African-American woman. She's a pioneer to buy a house in Womontown. I was with Bev for 25 years. COVID took her, and she was an entrepreneur. She was fun, and she was always willing to try a new adventure, and that was it.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Max. The first time I watched the documentary, that part hit me so profoundly because I realized it was really my first encounter with a creative project that was reflecting how our lives have really changed through COVID. So I wonder, Sandy, if you can talk a little bit about how you made the decision of where to put that particular part into the documentary, and more broadly about how you went about telling the story that you did through the film.
And that was one of the things. Bev, I missed Bev by weeks. I mean, I met Sue and she was like, you need to meet Bev. Here's her phone number, da, da, da. And I contacted Sue a couple of weeks later and she told me that Bev had died that day. And so that was a real loss to me because I knew she would have amazing stories. And it also, you know, reinforced to me how much we need to get these stories while we can. So we knew we wanted to do something about Bev, and we weren't exactly sure where we wanted to put it, because in some ways it can feel kind of random, just put in the middle of the show, but we found a way to kind of link it all together. And it really helped when Sue had one VHS tape that I had just looked at looking for construction footage. They were building the Women's Center, and we had it transferred, and I was looking at it, and I was just looking for old pictures of houses or how these houses looked when these women were first moving into them. But later on, Emily, who's my production partner, watched the whole thing and found these clips. And so right before you cut off with that clip, the next piece is Maryann waving to Bev, who's running the camera, and you get to hear Bev laughing. And we have one shot of Bev at the end of the show where you catch her, a glimpse of her in the mirror where she's shooting. But yeah, and so overall, it's always kind of difficult when you've got a piece. I always call them interview-driven pieces. We had hours. I mean, we interviewed, gosh, like I say, I'm thinking the number is 8. And each person, I let them talk for more than I normally would, because the other part of this is that I'm documenting these stories to go to the Gay and Lesbian Archive. When I'm done with them, everything gets donated to them. And so they received all of the interviews and all of the digital copies of photos and things that I scanned and used in the project. And one Womontown banner. We have a banner that you see in the show. That's the last Womontown flag that Drea saw in a doorway in Womontown when we were there in June, the year before shooting. And that woman donated it, gave it to me. I donated it to the Gay and Lesbian Archive so that they'll have that. But so it was shifting through, 8 hours of interviews. And a lot of it was just me asking a lot of questions about these women's lives when they were growing up. So it wasn't just about Womontown. But it is always difficult for me. I pick my favorite quotes as I'm going through. I'm like, got to include that, got to include that. And then you start trying to put it together to make a thread. And I actually did 2 edits. The first edit, and this later on we'll be talking about what got left on the cutting room floor, but the first edit was a little too much nuts and bolts, according to Emily, because I was just in love with, to me, they were so smart about everything. They were smart about putting together a landlord tenants association. They were smart about going in to the neighborhood association and kicking those people's asses. You know, they were so smart about the partnerships with the Nazarene Church, in so many ways, they were so smart, but we couldn't put all that in, you know, because we really wanted to also tell the more emotional heart stories that went through it. So we went back and forth, you know, could this be an hour-long show or what? And I was afraid it would be 45 minutes and then we'd have a hard time placing it. So we figured, we erred on the side of people wanting to see more and wanting to learn more. So
that's great. And I think this is a great time to bring in Maryann and Drea. So let me introduce them quickly, and then we'll bring them into the conversation with us. Marian Hopper, whose crone name is B-Leaf Cronwright, graduated from Arkansas Tech and the University of Memphis. She was a college English professor and a software technical writer for many years. After coming out as a lesbian in 1977, her activism took the form of protesting violence against women in Memphis, petitioning for lesbian gay rights in Washington, D.C., and celebrating in lesbian gay pride marches in Kansas City and Atlanta. From 1989 to 1994, she managed snail mail communication with hundreds of women who responded to ads in Lesbian Connection about the intentional women's urban community in Kansas City called Womontown that she created with her partner, Drea Nedelsky. Andrea, whose crone name is Drea Firewalker, graduated from the University of Missouri at Kansas City. She was a security guard in the early pride marches in Kansas City. While running her own property management and maintenance business, she became involved in neighborhood politics, seeing firsthand land power brokers' schemes and discrimination of marginalized women. The need to help secure a place for lesbians to live and thrive prompted her, sorry, my screen went for a minute, prompted her and her partner, Maryann Hopper, to lead a movement to transform her 12 by 12 block neighborhood in Kansas City, Missouri, into the community called Womontown. So I want to have you two pick up here and tell us a little bit about the genesis of Womontown, how it started. You know, tell us a little bit of your story of the community.
I think as we begin, we think about when we were first in Womontown, and it was really kind of a dangerous neighborhood. And we wished more friends had lived nearby. And we looked around and said, can't we imagine that all these houses, these apartment buildings nearby us, and there were a lot of apartment buildings interspersed between the homes there, wouldn't it be our dream really of all our friends would really be living here? And that magical idea, we thought, why can't we make that happen? And wish we'd had internet then. All these wonderful squares would have been living next door to us now, instead of an ad in LC and a big stack of letters that I constantly communicated with. So, and your thoughts on that, Drea?
Yeah, and I think because of my background with being involved with so many inner city properties and neighborhoods, just, you know, when I looked at it, it was like, well, what if we were to really make this our neighborhood? I mean, other neighborhoods had, you know, you had Valentine and you had Roanoke, all these little neighborhoods, just general neighborhoods where people migrated to. And here we were sitting in Dutch Hill in an area that had kind of been was absolutely neglected and was set aside and just waiting for the developers to come in and kind of put it on the ground. And it was like, let's beat them to the punch. Let's get our women in these houses. They're affordable, they're doable, and I was willing to take on the politics and the grief that came with it to make this happen. And I was very aware we had a very short time to do it, because once developers recognize an area is up for grabs, it's gone. So we're just like right on the cusp. And we were determined to do a what if we all lived here in this neighborhood.
And so the neighborhood, one of the, I think, distinguishing things about Womontown is that it's an urban neighborhood, right?
Yes.
And so you have
Yes.
a high population density, relatively small, modest lots with homes. And as you mentioned, also mixed single family homes, apartment buildings. And how many people at its height came and bought or occupied different properties in Womontown?
I think we were close to 100, don't you?
Yeah, I would say as far as people, the women that came, it was well over 100. There was a lot that came and left. The realization that you have to be focused on the fact that this is city living. This is it's already diversified. It's already there. You're in the heart of the sounds and the noise and the smells of the city. And there were women that came that said, I am a suburban gal, I'm out of here. They supported us, but they knew they couldn't live there. So in total, though, we had about 80 some that actually moved in during the time, say like from 1990 to 95. But we had, after that, we still up through 2015 when we finally sold our property to 2 lesbians. Lesbians were still moving in because they were looking for this area that they had heard rumor that that's where the lesbians live. And sure enough, that's where we lesbians live. And what was interesting is we had borders that protected our 12 block radius. So we had businesses on all sides, which we definitely took in consideration at the time of developing this, because by taking those borders, it gave us some insulation as well as security to say, well, there's a hospital all developing on this side, so there's job security. There's businesses on another side, and that's future development for if we wanted to start art community or whatever. There was Hallmark Cards, which is big in Kansas City, so that was another border. And then, of course, the Nazarene was a huge border for us, and all of those players became allies of ours because they saw the benefits of stabilizing a neighborhood that was slated for the blight, for the leveling of some wonderful, wonderful historical homes and histories and so forth. So
that's great. Tell us a little, Lynette has asked in the chat, wanting to hear more about the smart community actions, and in particular, like tell us about the Nazarene Church. Like, how were they an ally? What did you all do?
It was a Nazarene publishing house as well. It wasn't just a church there. It was a business as well.
It wasn't a church at all. The Nazarene
They
Church,
owned the property.
the church was out on 63rd outside our, but their publisher place was there. And so they became they were buying up a lot of properties to secure their development of building their business. And they're buying both sides of where they were housed. So,
yeah. And I want to clarify for people reading the text as we go along. The text is rendering it as Nazi. It's not Nazi. It's Nazarene. Nazarene, which is I believe a Christian community.
It is.
I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, yes, it's a Christian church. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it tends to be more conservative, but it was the publishing house. But the other things that we did there we're dealing with city programs and city restrictions and codes and zoning and the long-term plans that a developer did have to gentrify the neighborhood. And so we had Karen West, the woman that Sandy originally met, we managed to take over the neighborhood association and Karen West wrote our master plan, and our master plan was submitted to the city, and we thwarted the main developer, which was, he was quite angry for quite a while, but it was quite a coup to be able to do that. So that's one issue in terms of urban living, that neighborhoods that maybe are not totally as up to date as some, that they tend to spot. So Drea is always saying, watch out for the developers. And indeed they are watching.
So Drea, tell us more about why watch out for the developers. Tell us a little bit more.
Because economic community development is where the funding comes through to help low income housing. And what happens is developers have first access, because as long as they build something and say, well, we will set aside 10% of our development for low income, they have the money to go in and literally eminent domain, snatch up the property, lay it down and rebuild, therefore gentrifying an area by putting 90% middle class and above, and the 10% lower income. So that's what we were up against, was if we can get our master plan and say, we are stabilizing, we are here, we don't need to be blighted, we don't need to be eminent domain, we don't need your economic community monies. We just need your programs like the paint program or the weatherization program or the curb service program. That's what we needed. So that's why it was a dance of time, because if we got our master plan accepted before the developers, we had some clout. Even though I will say it was a tight walk between, it took so much energy through the association that took away from the what if we brought all of our friends in, because while our friends were coming in and buying houses and being happy and excited, we were still walking that fine line, which I was totally aware of, that time was of the essence before the swing could happen. And money sure dictates a lot. So we had to show that our neighborhood was coming up in value and that we were worth saving, so that taxes could be taken from us, even though not as much as before. But I mean, it was a dance. And that's why I often would say to the women, we only have this short time before we will be discovered as a viable neighborhood for banks to come in and loan money, because up until then they didn't loan money. We were red line. Before the gay men realized, because gay men love Victorian homes, stereotype or not, but once they saw it, they were coming in. And once they started coming in, the houses that were 20,000 to 40,000 flipped, and all of a sudden we were at 75,000 to 125,000 in a relatively short time. Yes. And
that seems like a small amount of money maybe now because of housing prices, not small, but definitely. But back when we were looking at houses, there were houses for 5,000, 10 and 25,000 that were 3-story Victorian homes. And so we were really encouraging women to buy things together, live on different floors and whatever, even by apartment buildings. And so these things were relatively within someone's grasp at that very short window.
So you're really talking about a window and balancing these kind of questions of how can you create an intentional urban lesbian community, but also how can you kind of economically revitalize an area so that people can purchase homes, but at the same time make sure that gentrification doesn't take off, so that the very people you're trying to build community with get priced out and can't afford it.
Right, absolutely. Right. So as many cities are experiencing now.
Yes.
Yeah. As well as in Womontown today, houses start around 300,000 and up.
Right. So we wouldn't have targeted that neighborhood.
Right.
Today.
Right.
Today.
Right. So tell us about the time frame. I think like one in the documentary, it really looks like things are coming together and you're starting to organize around Womontown in the late 80s. And the heyday seems to be from that time through the mid 90s. What What is that accurate, and what happens afterward?
Yes, though that was really the time that I kind of look at as momentum was really high, because we had a lot of people that were interested in it. We went to National Women's Music Fest in Bloomington. We went different places publicizing it. We had brochures. And so a lot of women were coming in, flying in, as well as driving in and spending weekends. And we would do tours of the neighborhood and meet other women and have potlucks, of course, and do other fun things. And so the momentum was really exciting, and people would come, they would meet a whole group of people who were already living there. They would turn around, and within a few months they would come themselves and sometimes bring other friends. So what we were saying in terms of the build of Womontown was the momentum was very high for the first few years. Then people got jobs, then people settled in, then people got girlfriends, got new girlfriends, fought with the old girlfriends, some people left, more people came in. People's ordinary lives kind of took over, and therefore the building of the momentum of calling other friends or whatever, as we all do, we have groups of friends then within Womontown, and so people were comfortable there. And our energy was then shifted into kind of a maintenance mode when we realized we had to get involved in the neighborhood association. We had to figure out the city codes and what things that we could do to help maintain the neighborhood. And maintenance, as we all know, is never as much fun as the original stuff. And so even though a number of people stayed for a number of years, we kept property for a number of years. My job shifted to Atlanta, but we kept our property and an apartment there until 2015. So we were still involved in the neighborhood association and a lot of activities for many years. So the dream and talking about the concept of an urban community, we've talked about most of our lives since the 90s. So many people know us originally from what can we do to take over your neighborhood or wherever you live,
And one of the things that I recognized when we hit that momentum, one of the needs in that neighborhood was there were a lot of apartment buildings. So we had started a landlord-tenant group that was a whole entity in itself. And we stayed very, very involved until we left in 2015, where we still met the different landlords. We still made sure we were using the same criteria. We were just keeping in check because that could, if the landlord tenant, if those apartments had flipped back to where they were, which were slumlord investors, if they had flipped, it would have made Womontown really hard to even today exist. But because they have stayed stable and gone up in value as well, that has helped secure the housing stock of the women and other allies that moved in that neighborhood. It really has created a sense of safety and security, where at one time, if you walked past an apartment building, you had to worry about being shot or drugs running out. That was, and to take it from that and flip it to where you waved to the people sitting on the porch and chatted and say, when you buy a house in the neighborhood, that's where we had to go to, and that's where it landed. And so even today, that is still very stable. And I do credit a lot of the landlords being willing to come into this group and form their own solid power structure, as to speak, to ensure that we didn't fall into a blight mentality.
Well, even the neighborhood we live in now, if we see an empty house, we start asking any friend we have if they need a new place to live.
We do.
So we never have stopped that concept. And you should all do it too, wherever you live. If there's an empty house down the block, don't worry who's going to move in. Find somebody to move in.
Right.
That you like, of course.
That is true.
So there's this, I mean, one of the things that's really wonderful hearing you talk about is this kind of balance between building community in intentional ways, kind of building lesbian communities, connecting with people around you, but and also then having interfacing with the city and making sure that you get resources that you need, and that there are not, that you really have a space that is respected by the larger kind of institutional and city or regional power structure
That's
that
true.
you're living within. I'm going to raise up from the comments. Edie Daly and Jackie Merkin note that the same thing happened in Paducah, Kentucky. The city gave no interest loans to artists to come and live in Paducah, and it transformed part of their town. Barb Esther says, Drea, you mentioned politics and grief. Can you say more about that?
Politics and grief.
Politics, just because, you know, it takes away from the energy of bringing the lesbians in. I mean, in the sense of you.
Like the neighborhood association politics. Yeah, that was very heavy.
Yeah, the neighborhood association had their philosophy. The one before we turned it over and took it over was get the highest price, find a developer, and get the heck out. And that was their push. They were not thinking about the poor people that were left behind there, which were primarily women of color, lesbians who lower income, like myself. I mean, we were marginalized. And the neighborhood association, who absolutely did not like tenants, absolutely did not like poverty, absolutely had a kind of a hostile view towards the diversity of this neighborhood, even though they lived in a diverse neighborhood. Their take was really different. So the politics, the grief was, it tired me down. And I wanted them to see the enthusiasm of creating something new and healthy. Yes, lesbians first and allies second. That was my take on it. That's why I could do the landlord tenants and I could do the bankers and I could do, because they were second and they were allies. But it just the grief of watching the kind of the backbiting of people that said one thing and did something else.
And there were a lot of white males that owned all those buildings. And a lot of the people that were part of the neighborhood association were older white people who had lived in these old houses for many years. Not many of the single women were very supportive of us, but a lot of the old white guys were not happy to see that their majority was being diminished when more and more lesbians started showing up at these community meetings and demanding, why wasn't this street light fixed that you talked about last meeting? And oh, they just dropped it because it wasn't on their street or right in front of their house. So that political, just keeping on and keeping notes all the time of who to be wary of, that was very wearing.
Yeah. And the other thing about this whole thing is this was an intentional out neighborhood. So we were showing up and walking the streets not as victims to this neighborhood that was perceived as blight and those white men wanting to get out of the neighborhood. We were showing up in numbers and saying, hey, we like this. And so we were showing our power. And I know that was really important. And again, somebody, why didn't more lesbians come? Because they had to be willing to do I look at the women who came and stayed, the strength that they had, because they had to look the system and say, I'm not going to be your victim. I'm not going to cave. I'm going to be in control of my home, my safe, my space, and who I am as a lesbian. And they had to deal with us. And that was very, very hard for some people, even women who were bright, smart women, straight women that I thought would have been our allies, turned on us. And that was hard to take, because it was like, once they realized that my effort and Maryann's was to make this a lesbian enclave, they didn't like it. And they let me know it in many different ways. So
that's great. I'm going to pull Sandy back into the conversation, but I'd like each of you to talk about, what do you hope will come from this documentary? Drea and Maryann, what's your hope for the documentary?
Well, I think the story being told I think I hope it does inspire other women to realize that nothing against land dykes, because we went to lots of women's land and loved being there, but those who wanted to live in cities but still wanted to create community didn't feel like that it all had to be done online or via the internet, or your friends were the only way to communicate, that you can be together and do things. And I think really being energetic and creating things together does build community, not just having distance, but actually putting the energy in. Because as Drea said, it was a lot of energy every week, all the time, to be thinking about going to the next meeting, dealing with the next issue, and planning it together.
Mm-hmm. I know one of the things when I was first proposing this idea at the station, people were really excited about the idea. We talk a lot about gentrification in Kansas City right now and houselessness and things like that. So this was very on target for what we've been covering or had been covering over this last year at the station anyway. And that's the part I thought was so awesome, is that they were fixing up the neighborhood not to flip the houses and make money. They were fixing up the neighborhood so they could stay there and live there. And I think, you know, when we try to figure out what are the ways to improve neighborhoods, but not throw everybody out or not make it so it's not affordable for people anymore, it is difficult to know how to do that. But I think this is an idea for that. And as far as what I want people to take away from this beyond that idea is just the idea that if you have something that you want to do, bring your friends together and make it happen. You know, right. Don't be afraid of trying to make it work. I mean, right. Somehow or another, of course, you got a perfect mix with Maryann and Drea, because you got marketing and you've got the builder, you know, and you're both good communicators and community builders. But I think people should just not be afraid to try to create these things. And maybe by seeing that this group of women did this in really pretty crappy circumstances and made a success out of it, I hope people can take that away.
Right. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And so are women, there's still a lot of lesbian homeowners in Womontown today?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And they're still operating the neighborhood association? And so in many ways, is it fair to say Womontown continues, or is it changing in different ways as we're in this new part of the century?
Well, I would say the spirit of it is there, and the people are, as I said, the momentum of inspiring folks to come is not there as much anymore, because people are living their individual lives there now. But the idea that women live together, that they own things, that folks live in apartments and stuff there, that it is a neighborhood that is viable. That part is still there.
So I was working on our property, getting ready to sell the building in 2015, because I'm older now, and it was a realization that we couldn't continue working on it. But I had an apartment there all those years, and I'm out there working, and two lesbians are walking down the alley, and they say hey to me, and they said, "We heard this is Womontown. What is it? Where is it?" And so I struck up the conversation. Now I will tell you, they bought a house there in Womontown in 2015, but they were there. They were walking down an alley that at one time, nobody walked down that alley, but here they were, hand in hand, just like we talked, hand in hand, walking down, checking out. And so yes, it's still viable. It's shifted, but it's there. It's safer. And it's known out in the world. And when people ask us about it, where would you live if you were going to Kansas City? We would tell them, go to Womontown, great place. There's, a lot of advocates there.
Great. And and John Du Bois says, I drove around the neighborhood today and prepped for tonight. The houses are stunningly beautiful and everything seems well kept. Thank you, Maryann and Drea, for helping to preserve these homes. In our practice session, we were all talking about, and I want to put it here for people to put in the chat, we were talking about other lesbian intentional urban communities. Edie and Jackie note that in the 1990s, folks in Gulfport, Florida, advertised in Lesbian Connection. And so more lesbians bought homes there, so it became Dykeport. I think that lots of folks would argue that Gulfport, Florida is an intentional urban lesbian community. We of course talked about Carefree, which at its start was a little more, not rural, but more suburban, a little more isolated. Now it has really grown, I think, over the past couple of decades. So if there are, and Meryl Mushroom talks about, she's in a rural setting in Middle Tennessee, but lots of gay men and lesbians and hippies, people recruited their friends to come live with them in Middle Tennessee. And so I just want to sort of put out there that I think Sandy and everyone's always interested in hearing about other intentional urban lesbian communities. I want to thank all three of you for joining us this evening and for sharing the film. I was really excited by it and loved seeing it. Sandy, I thank you for all of your work. Leith and Drea, I thank you for the work that you put into building lesbian communities and thinking about how we can live our lives in different and meaningful ways. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you all. Now, Max, it's time for our dance number. I invite folks to put stuff into the chat as we go along. Sierra has the More Sinister Wisdom events. I'll be highlighting folks on the screen as you're dancing. So our two pins right now are Sandy, Drea, and Maryann. And so you guys start dancing when Max starts the music, and then we'll highlight other folks as well.
Indeed. Wonderful to see you all.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yes. Come visit.
Sandy. All of you, come visit. Womontown too, our neighbors.
There's a house for sale down the street.
Come on and say the L word. It's the only chance you got to reclaim our name and not live in shame to try to improve our lot. Come on and say the L word. It's the only chance you got to stop the lying and denying. And come on and give it a shot. And everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Now, the last time you said the L word, did your stomach take a turn? Did you look around and see if the sound was loud enough to make the ears burn? Did you say it in a whisper, or did you just say gay? Did your face turn red? Did you decide instead to save it for another day? Then to yourself say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian.
We know there are risks involved. No oppressed group has ever gained their freedom without risk. And no oppressed group has ever gained their freedom without a visible movement. So right here, in broad daylight on the courthouse steps, we want to take this day to announce the official launching of the Fairness Campaign to work toward fairness and justice for lesbians and gays, and to see that fairness entrenched in city
Do you
law.
think it sounds like a rare disease, a perversion, a plague, a vice? All it takes is a little practice. Come on and take my advice, and everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Because if you can't say it, it's hard to be it. If you can't be it, they can't see it. If they can't see or death. Silence equals death. Come on.
Violence against lesbians and gays has increased every year since the start of the AIDS crisis. We still fear losing our jobs. We are denied places to live. We are here today to say enough is enough. We are ready to live as full and equal members of society. And we are ready to fight
Enough
for
is
our
enough.
freedom.
So give me an L. Give me an E. Give me an
E.
S. Give me a B. Give me an I. Hey, and everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian.
This is a significant time in our community and our visibility as a movement. We must be strong and proud and out.
The next time you say the L word, think of the woman next to you, or your teammate on the soccer field, or the wise one that's helping you through. And think of your high school basketball coach, or your last music festival crush, or your ultimate erotic fantasy. It's okay to blush. Find a mirror, look yourself in the eye, and with warm regard, say the L word, say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Everyone say lesbian.
Lesbian.
Thank you all. We'll see you in 2 weeks at our next event, Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. Have a great week.
Mwah.